Hello everyone. Today, we won't be venturing into grand castles, mighty warriors, or famous kings in history. No, today, we're stepping into another world. A world few people know. A part of history that's never recorded in glorious paintings or in the pages of grand historical records. We will go back in time, not to magnificent dynasties, but to those who lived quietly in the shadows of time, the medieval peasants, the silent laborers, with no titles, no power, just endless long days and short nights, toiling and working, living a life that was nothing more than mere existence. They were the ones without horses, without crowns, not sung about in history books or celebrated in victory songs. They were not brave warriors or noble kings. Instead, they were quiet sufferers, small souls swept up in the waves of history they could not change. They fought against the cold, hunger, plagues, and sudden death, all without a single cry for help, forgotten by time. These peasants lived in poor villages, in dilapidated homes, not the grand castles you see in fairy tales. Their houses were a mixture of wood, clay, and grass, built not to stand forever, but only to survive through each season, each year, each storm. Their lives seemed insignificant, but it was this life that made everything we have today. There were no electric lights, no modern conveniences we are accustomed to, only long, dark nights, with the dim light of the hearth, manual labor, and close-knit family and community relationships. And in this harsh world, it was these very peasants who carried with them a quiet strength, a strength that most of us wouldn't survive even a single day in. Today, we will explore and understand more about these people, their lives, the hardships they faced, and how they lived, loved, and died in a world that had nothing but perseverance and unseen strength. If this story about these peasants helps you unwind, please click like and subscribe to continue following, but only if it truly brings you peace. And don't forget to leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from and the time right now. Every time I see someone immersed in the same story as I am, it brings a strange and comforting feeling. So, dim the lights, turn on the fan if you enjoy the soft sound of the wind, relax, and let's begin, stepping into a forgotten corner of history, where the simplest people lived and endured for centuries. This village, no matter how hard you try to search for it on a map, you will never find it. It has no name, or if it ever did, no one remembers it now. It lies deep within a small valley, so far that even the main roads can't reach it. Here, time itself seems to stand still, quiet, untouched by the dust of the outside world. The moss-covered paths and narrow walkways leading into the village are rarely traveled, with no wide roads or clean paved streets, only muddy, rugged roads twisting like an arch through time. The village, with its chilly air in winter and sweltering heat in summer, holds a silent beauty that most people overlook. Every house in the village is built simply and roughly. These houses never stand out or differ from one another. There are no sturdy pillars, no grand archways, but instead, the homes are constructed from mud, grass, and wood, put together with the humble hands of the villagers. These houses have nothing but thatched roofs, worn and stiff, with gaps that let in both the winter cold and the summer heat. The main door of each house is simply a thin wooden plank, offering little protection, except to block the wind and rain from blowing in. When you step into the village, you'll immediately notice a distinct smell, not of flowers or new wood, but of earth, of mud, of the smoky scent of the hearths inside the homes, the smell of animals, of human sweat, of dry firewood, and the faint scent of wild grass lingers in the air. It's the smell of a simple, rustic life, grounded and real. Each home is part of a living body, with the gentle sounds of animals and the soft murmur of people at work. Every family in the village owns a few small animals, like chickens, goats, and pigs, to sustain them through the days. Despite living in poverty, the people here find ways to survive day by day. They work from dawn until sunset, toiling hard in the fields, from the barley crops to the small garden behind their houses. The families don't own much land. Everything belongs to the lords, who only pass by a few times a year. Yet they still work diligently, tirelessly, and with great effort. A large part of their lives consists of plowing the land, sowing seeds, harvesting the crops, and caring for the livestock. And all of this takes place within the narrow confines of the village. In the humility and simplicity of their existence, from the small houses to the patches of open land. Everything blends together into a silent picture, where time seems to slow down. The people in the village are not strangers. They are familiar faces, known for years, living under the same sky, sharing stories, difficulties, and joys. There is nothing mysterious or strange, but these relationships are special. Unlike anywhere else, everyone knows each other, from family members and friends to neighbors. Each person understands the work and struggles of the other. Whenever someone faces a problem, others will help willingly, without calculation. The sky above is vast, but not always bright. Sometimes, it's covered with gray clouds, signaling an incoming rain, making the air feel even heavier. Strong winds blow across the fields, bending the wild grasses with each gust. The rain comes suddenly, sometimes lasting for days, and when it stops, the air becomes damp, cold, and thick, as though you can feel every breath of the earth and sky. The atmosphere is hard to describe. You can only feel it when you immerse yourself in the setting. Each day passes like a repeating cycle. The bell from the distant church rings, marking the time of day. Without that bell, the villagers rely on the sunlight to tell the time, or they gauge the weariness in their bodies. Every field, every corner of the garden belongs to each family, cared for and protected by them. The land has no clear boundaries. It's simply the patches of garden that have been cultivated through generations, with no exact divisions, only the memories of those who came before and planted the seeds. At night, when the sky darkens, the village sinks into darkness. There are no electric lights, no artificial lighting like in the modern world, only the flickering lights from the houses. The long nights become particularly quiet, with the barking of dogs, the wind blowing through the leaves, and occasionally, the hurried footsteps of someone returning home. The atmosphere is heavy, filled with the smell of earth and dampness. No matter how simple or rough the village is, it is still home to everyone. The people living here do so not just for material survival, but because of the deep emotional bonds that have tied them together. It's where they live, where they understand that every day is a battle to survive. But at the same time, it's also a comfort, a place where they find hope. However small, every step, every task is done with the hope that, even in the most basic things, it is enough to keep going, to keep fighting. This village is a testament to a simple yet enduring life, with little change, no major events to remember, but it holds the stories of everyday lives, quiet lives that never give in to the trials of time. Daily life. The life of the villagers in a feudal society moves slowly, with the daily pace determined by nature, and the necessary labor tasks required to sustain life. This is a society with few quick changes, and most things proceed according to the natural laws of the land, the weather, and the duties that each person must complete. The day begins at sunrise. Each morning in the village, the first crowing of the roosters typically signals the start of a new day. Without clocks, everyone in the village knows the time by natural signs, such as the sunlight or the length of the tree shadows. The farmers wake up very early, around 4 to 5 a.m., when the first light of day appears. Whether it's winter or summer, their homes might just be a simple room with a thatched roof, and most families live in small, cramped spaces, often sharing their homes with livestock such as pigs, chickens, cows, and goats. Breakfast is often an essential part of their daily lives, though it is simple, usually just grain porridge or some dry bread. Bread in the feudal village is mostly made from barley or corn, thick and heavy. The typical food is pottage, a thick soup made from vegetables and grains, sometimes with a little meat if the harvest was good, but most of the time, it serves as the main dish for the family. Agricultural work and farming life. Each day, the villagers typically spend the majority of their time working in the fields. They are the ones who sow the seeds, harvest the crops, and tend to the plants. Their lives are dictated by the cycles of the crops: spring for sowing, summer for care, autumn for harvesting, and winter for surviving through the cold months. Most of their work is done by hand and with rudimentary tools like hoes, shovels, and hand plows. Their fields are vast, without the modern machinery we see today, and farming relies mainly on the labor of people and animals. During the harvest season, the whole family and the villagers join in together, collecting grains like barley, wheat, corn, and beans to ensure enough food for the entire year. In winter, when it's cold and the agricultural work decreases, people often spend time repairing tools, fixing homes, or doing other essential tasks, like slaughtering livestock, to prepare for the coming spring. Markets and trade relations in the village. The feudal village is not entirely isolated from the outside world, although it is remote and there isn't much direct trade. Rural markets, if they exist, usually occur a few times a month. The farmers can bring their products to the market to exchange or sell. Commonly traded items include wheat, corn, meat, eggs, milk, livestock, and poultry. However, these exchanges are typically very simple, not involving money but rather bartering of goods. In addition, if the village has connections with nearby towns or cities, some products like fabrics, spices, or even tools like knives, basins, or pots might be brought into the village to meet the villagers' needs. These products are brought in by merchants or traders. Family and community life. In a feudal household, the living space is often very cramped. Most families live in 1 or 2 rooms, with family members including parents, grandparents, children, and sometimes other relatives, particularly during the cold days. Everyone tends to sleep in the same room to stay warm. At night, when all the work is done, the whole family gathers around the fire, eats simply, talks, and shares stories of the day. The unity within the family and community is crucial for them to overcome difficulties. Villagers frequently help each other, from sharing food during hard seasons to assisting with house repairs during storms or floods. Community feasts, such as harvest festivals or religious holidays, are also times when everyone gathers together, engaging in games, singing, and praying. Feudal politics. In feudal society, politics and power are primarily concentrated in the noble classes, with peasants and lower classes having little influence or power. The power structure is divided into distinct layers: the king, the nobles, and the peasants. Below is a detailed look at feudal politics in the village. The position of peasants in feudal society. Peasants in feudal society do not have the same freedom we think of today. While they are not slaves, they are still bound by many obligations to the landowners and society. In most cases, peasants do not own land, but only have the right to farm the land of the lords, and must pay a portion of the harvest to them. They live under the supervision of the lords or local officials, who have the authority to govern all activities in the village, from tax collection to managing labor and handling minor disputes within the community. The lord is not only the landowner, but also the one who decides on taxes, punishes violators of rules, and sometimes grants privileges to those loyal to them. The power structure and leadership in the village. Each village has a village head, sometimes appointed by the king or the lord, and in many cases, this person holds a certain level of authority in the community. The village head is tasked with maintaining order, settling disputes, and ensuring that everyone in the village fulfills their labor obligations. However, they are only a part of the power structure established by the lords, who hold absolute power. In addition to the village head, the head of each family is usually respected as a person with small authority in the community. They do not hold political power per se, but they can decide many everyday matters within the community, from labor allocation to organizing important events in the village. Power distribution and control by the church. Religion plays an important role in feudal politics. The church is not only a center of faith but also a center of power. Clergymen and bishops, who lead dioceses, hold significant influence in feudal society. The church controls much of the spiritual matters while also engaging in political issues by collecting taxes, tithes, and other forms of control over power. Furthermore, the church also keeps valuable books, serves as a center of education, and spreads religious doctrines. They influence many decisions in the community, such as festivals, harvests, or legal matters related to land and families. They can influence the lords, and sometimes even demand that the king follow their decisions. In the next section, we will delve into the uprisings in feudal society, where peasants sometimes became too frustrated and sought to overthrow the oppressive systems, or at least resist the harsh policies of the lords. Illness and death in feudal society. Life in medieval Europe was not only difficult due to poverty, war, and harsh living conditions, but it was also profoundly impacted by disease and death. The lack of medical knowledge, underdeveloped healthcare infrastructure, and uncontrollable natural factors created an environment where illness and death were close companions, and often inevitable, in the daily lives of the people. Illness in the feudal era. Illness in the feudal society was diverse, and the onset of diseases was often due to ignorance of hygiene, poor living conditions, and the lack of effective treatments. One of the main causes of illness was the absence of sanitation. Contaminated water, unsafe food, and crowded, damp living conditions made it easy for infectious diseases to spread. Illness in the feudal period can be categorized into several types, including infections, plagues, and environment-related diseases. Infectious diseases. During the medieval period, infectious diseases were the leading cause of death. People had no knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or other pathogens, so they couldn't understand how diseases spread or developed. Some of the most common infectious diseases included diarrhea, respiratory diseases, skin diseases, and illnesses like malaria. Diarrhea and food poisoning. With diets primarily made up of raw or simply prepared foods, many people suffered from diarrhea or food poisoning caused by bacteria or parasites. Diarrhea was one of the leading causes of death for children in medieval society. Skin diseases. Skin diseases like ulcers, boils, scabies, and fungi were common due to filthy living conditions and the lack of hygiene. Wounds that were not treated promptly or cleaned properly often led to infections and necrosis. Respiratory diseases. Respiratory diseases like pneumonia, bronchitis, and other breathing-related illnesses were also common in medieval society. These diseases often spread quickly in densely populated and poorly ventilated communities, particularly in the winter when people gathered together in damp, stuffy houses without fresh air. Plagues. Plagues were among the most dangerous diseases in feudal society. These plagues not only wiped out individuals, but could also destroy entire communities. One of the most famous plagues in medieval history was the Black Death. The Black Death, considered one of the deadliest health disasters in European history. The Black Death killed around 25 million people in the 14th century. The cause of the plague was a bacterium named Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas from rats. When this plague spread, both cities and rural areas were devastated. People did not understand that it was caused by bacteria or viruses. They only knew that death came quickly and was untreatable. People who contracted the plague usually died within days, with symptoms like high fever, swollen lymph nodes, intense pain, and coughing up blood. Smallpox. Another deadly disease that killed millions in the medieval period was smallpox. This disease caused large blisters to form on the skin, accompanied by high fever, fatigue, and muscle aches. Smallpox could either be fatal or leave severe scars, altering the appearance of survivors. With no vaccine or effective treatment, smallpox was one of the greatest fears of the people. Diseases caused by environmental factors. Medieval living conditions also contributed to the outbreak of diseases. Floods, droughts, or extreme weather conditions could disrupt farming and food supplies, leading to prolonged periods of famine. Many diseases related to malnutrition, such as rickets and anemia, occurred when people did not receive the necessary vitamins and minerals. Death in feudal society. Death was an inseparable part of life in feudal times. Whether from illness, war, or accidents in labor, death was always present and unavoidable. Moreover, death was not just the passing of an individual, but also a part of the religious and cultural rituals of medieval society. Death from illness. As mentioned, illness was one of the main causes of death in feudal society. Plagues or infections could devastate entire families. When a family member died from illness, organizing the funeral was of great importance, whether the deceased was a poor peasant or a noble. In cases like the plague, when many people died at once, funerals often had to be rushed. The dead were often buried in mass graves or simple graves, with minimal ceremonies. Because death came too quickly and the number of deaths was overwhelming, the survivors had to accept the massive loss without enough time to mourn or conduct a proper funeral. Death from war. War was a significant factor contributing to death in the feudal period. Wars often occurred between lords or between kingdoms, and soldiers had to face death on the battlefield. In battles, fighters not only had to face dangers from enemies but also from diseases caused by poor sanitation and inadequate food supplies. Those who died in battle were not always given a proper burial. Sometimes, the dead were left on the battlefield without any ceremonies, or they were hastily buried to prevent the spread of disease. Death from accidents and labor. In feudal society, the laborious work also led to death. Farmers had to work hard in the fields with rudimentary tools, often facing accidents like broken arms or legs, or falling from great heights. These accidents could lead to death if medical care was not available in time. Death from labor or accidents often had no formal ceremonies and was simply considered part of the harsh realities of life. Rituals and beliefs related to death. Religion played an important role in explaining death and helping people cope with the pain of loss. Death was seen as a part of the human life cycle, and religious beliefs were the way people sought comfort. The belief in souls and the afterlife was something many believed in, and death was not seen as an end but as a transition to another life. Religious rituals. When someone died, their family members typically organized a funeral according to religious rites. The deceased would be taken to the church, where the priest would read prayers and perform the necessary rituals for the soul's journey. The funeral could last several days, and families would gather to remember the deceased. These rituals helped the family find peace and helped the soul of the deceased ascend to heaven. Beliefs in the soul. In addition to official religion, many peasants believed in folk beliefs about the soul. The dead might become ghosts or be protected by saints. These beliefs were often passed down through generations and became an inseparable part of village life.
In feudal society, family and village community life were the central aspects of existence. There were no complex social relationships like we have today. People in the village lived simple, close-knit lives and primarily relied on each other to survive the daily hardships of life. From working the fields, raising children, to handling disputes, everything was integrated into a system of moral values and familial relationships. Family life in the feudal era was mainly built upon the foundation of inheritance, respect for parents, and strict family rules. They were not only people who shared meals, but also individuals who worked together to protect the family from any challenge. In peasant families, parents were the leaders, holding significant authority over everything in the family, from managing assets to deciding who would do what. The father was typically the one who worked the fields and earned a living, while the mother was responsible for the household, taking care of the children and performing domestic chores. Importantly, mothers were also responsible for teaching their children moral values and life skills. Children in the family were usually divided according to their age and gender to perform different tasks. Boys often assisted their fathers with agricultural work, while girls learned how to manage household tasks, care for their mothers, and perform additional duties like weaving, sewing, and cooking. Although the father held the most power in the household, in some families, mothers also had significant influence, especially when the family faced hardships. The relationship between husband and wife was not always simple, but mutual respect in their respective roles was crucial to maintaining family stability. In feudal villages, the family was not just a small social unit, but also an essential part of a larger community. Each family typically lived in a simple house made of wood, stone, or earth, with a thatched or tiled roof. These homes were very basic, with no clear separation between living and working spaces. As a result, Families lived, ate, slept, and worked in the same area. The family structure in feudal villages was often closely knit. Family members were not only those who lived under one roof, but also individuals who worked together and depended on each other for survival. A family could consist of multiple generations, from grandparents, parents, children, to married daughters who had not yet started their own families. Within each family, roles were clearly defined among the members. Although feudal society primarily emphasized respect for and protection of the patriarch's authority, relationships between the different generations in a family were tightly bonded. Grandparents and parents often served as guides and educators, passing down life experience through generations. Children learned from the older generations how to work, behave, and survive in a harsh society. Relationships in the village were not limited to the family, but also extended to interactions between households. These relationships could be friendships, neighborly ties, or even rivalries in agricultural work. However, unlike in modern society, social connections were crucial, and villagers often supported each other during difficult times. For instance, during the harvest season, families would help one another with gathering grain or picking vegetables. One family might provide food to another when they faced difficulties. In some cases, if a family experienced a calamity like a house fire, villagers would collectively contribute money and labor to help. The village community also created opportunities for gathering during religious festivals, harvest celebrations, or even weddings and funerals. These occasions were not just times for families and neighbors to bond, but also for expressing solidarity and neighborly care. People helped each other in various situations, from small tasks like repairing homes to larger activities like building churches or contributing to religious affairs. In feudal society, relationships within the village were strongly influenced by religion and local laws. Religion not only served as a source of comfort during difficult times, but also played a key role in maintaining unity within the village. Village meetings, or large gatherings, often took place at the church, where everyone prayed for a bountiful harvest or peace within their families. However, not all relationships within families or between village households were smooth. Conflicts, whether within the family or between families in the village, were an inevitable part of life. Conflicts could arise for many reasons, from property disputes, land conflicts, to small misunderstandings in daily life. Within families, conflicts typically occurred between parents and children, especially as children grew older and began to seek their own lives. Disagreements over land ownership, labor rights, or marriage issues could sometimes lead to divisions within families. However, due to the leadership role of the father and the values of family respect, these conflicts were often resolved within the framework of family rules without causing major disruptions. In the village, conflicts between families were also common, especially when related to issues of rights or land disputes. These conflicts could be resolved by the village head or council, where those in authority would listen and decide on a reasonable solution, sometimes involving mediation or the exchange of goods or services. In feudal families, marital relationships were a combination of love and responsibility. However, love was not always a primary factor. Instead, it was often a union shaped by social and economic factors. Wives in the family were responsible not only for domestic work, but also participated in farm chores, took care of children, and assisted their husbands in managing family assets. Women in feudal society were not just mothers and wives, but also strategic players in maintaining family stability. They knew how to manage family resources, cared for the health of family members, and ensured that domestic and agricultural tasks were completed on time. While women's power in feudal society was limited, they played a crucial role in the survival of both the family and the village. They were the carriers of cultural values and customs for future generations, while also being the glue that held together relationships within the family and the community. This part of the family life and village relationship section details the fundamental aspects of family life and the interactions between family members, as well as the relationships within the village community in feudal society. These relationships encompassed not only interactions within the family, but also economic, religious, and legal elements present in feudal society. Religion, particularly Christianity, played an incredibly important role in the lives of people during the feudal period. During this time, the church was not only a place of worship, but also a center of social, educational, and administrative life. From small villages to large urban areas, the church held a role akin to a small empire, regulating nearly every aspect of life, from material concerns to the spiritual well-being of the people. The people living in feudal villages did not only view the church as a place for divine worship, but also as a symbol of supreme power. It was a place where the activities of daily life were dictated by the teachings and regulations of the church. Religion here was not just a belief system, but a force that intertwined with life, death, and all the important rituals of each individual. The lack of knowledge about the outside world and the surrounding dangers made people increasingly dependent on the church, which provided solace, hope, and, unfortunately, many constraints in their daily lives. The church, as the official religious institution, was where the faithful came to participate in religious rites. However, it also played a central role as a cultural and social hub. Whenever a significant event occurred in the life of the villagers, from weddings and funerals to large festivals, the church served as an indispensable intermediary. Every day, priests and monks would organize prayer services, recite scriptures, offer mass, and perform various religious ceremonies for the congregation. Even important decisions such as marriage or the distribution of family assets would be documented and authenticated by the church. The church became a place not only for worship, but also for the people to express their reverence towards the power of the church. Beyond its religious role, the church was also a powerful political force in feudal society. Priests, bishops, and even cardinals had considerable influence over kings and nobles. The church was not only the keeper of souls, but also a holder of wealth and political authority. A bishop, for instance, could control vast amounts of land, wealth, and power, making the church one of the most formidable forces in society, rivaling the nobility. Religion influenced not only the major events, but also the daily life of feudal peasants. Every morning, people would perform small rituals such as prayers, blessings, and remembrance of the patron saints. During important holidays like Easter or Christmas, the church became even more crucial. Every family was required to have at least one priest or a devout man in the household to offer prayers for the family members, particularly in times of illness or childbirth. These rituals provided peace of mind and protection from unforeseen dangers in life. Feudal religion was not only a source of peace, but also a cause of great fear for those who violated the church's laws and commands. People were often bound by rituals such as attending church services on Sundays, fasting during specific festivals, and living a moral life according to the church's strict rules. Committing sin, whether minor or major, could lead to severe punishment. Feudal people feared penalties such as being shunned or even judged if they failed to adhere to the church's teachings. Punishments were not only physical but also spiritual, such as being excommunicated or facing divine rejection. For feudal people, death was not the end, but an important transition, and the church played an irreplaceable role in funeral rites. When a person died, they were taken to the church for prayers to ensure their soul's passage to heaven. Priests would hold mass and pray for the deceased's soul, while the community would gather to pray and bid farewell. Beyond the prayers and funeral services, believers also believed that after death, the soul would undergo a purification process in purgatory, where it would be cleansed before entering heaven. The church became a central figure in helping the souls of the deceased with prayers, offerings, and charitable donations to reduce the time spent in purgatory. After death, the importance of religious rituals became even more apparent. Survivors had the responsibility to hold memorial services for the deceased, offer mass, light candles, and perform acts of charity to help the soul find peace. These rituals were not only a display of respect, but also a means to alleviate the sins of the deceased, helping them to be forgiven and to pass more easily into heaven. The feudal economy was primarily based on agriculture. Land was the most valuable asset, and land ownership not only determined one's social status, but also the survival of a family, community, or even an entire kingdom. The feudal system was built upon the relationships between different social classes, where peasants, as the producers, provided food for the nobility, clergy, and the military. In this system, peasants worked on lands owned by lords. In return, they had to pay taxes, perform free labor known as corvée, and provide surplus goods to their lords. Lords, with their control over land, were the central figures of the system, while the clergy and the church played a crucial role in regulating and distributing wealth, as well as establishing societal rules. From start to finish, all aspects of life and economy were tightly connected to the feudal system, with interdependent relationships and interactions between the king, nobility, peasants, and the church. Agriculture was the dominant force in the feudal economy, and land was the only resource used to sustain life. In this context, peasants played a vital role, yet they were also among the most powerless. Peasants depended on their crops for survival, and their lives were entirely dependent on agricultural production. A poor harvest could plunge an entire community into famine. Feudal agricultural labor was primarily carried out by peasants and slaves. Peasants worked the land of the lords, managed by feudal officials, and had to give a portion of their produce to the lords. For peasants working for larger lords, they had to fulfill labor obligations such as plowing, harvesting, animal husbandry, and constructing necessary buildings for the lord's estate. Additionally, the corvée system, forced labor, was a part of a peasant's duties to their lord. During harvest or construction, peasants could be forced to work for the lord without pay, aside from the taxes or food they already provided. Meanwhile, lords and the nobility were less involved in agricultural labor and primarily lived off land rent, taxes, and the benefits of land ownership. In the feudal system, land ownership represented power and social influence. Those who owned land, especially lords, controlled the agricultural economy. Peasants worked on their land, subjected to the lord's control, and had to fulfill labor duties and pay taxes. Lords owned large estates and had the right to decide how the land was used. This relationship persisted through generations with a strict inheritance system. Lords had the authority to allocate land, but their ownership was not absolute. Land passed from generation to generation through inheritance, and this inheritance was often tied to obligations and relationships with the church and military. In feudal society, not everyone had the right to own land. The poor, peasants, and lower social groups did not own land and had to work for the lords. The feudal system established a clear divide between landowners and laborers. In feudal times, trade was not as significant to the economy as it would be in later societies. The economy was mainly self-sufficient, with villages and rural areas producing what they needed to survive. Agricultural products like wheat, barley, meat, and livestock were produced mainly to supply the community, with only a small portion exchanged with other areas. However, in larger cities and more powerful regions, trade began to develop. Markets and trade guilds were places where agricultural goods, textiles, crafts, and other valuable items were exchanged. Merchants started to play an important role in feudal societies, though they still had to operate within the constraints of social rules and were controlled by rulers, lords, and clergy. In the feudal system, power was not centralized, but rather spread out across many classes. The king was the head, but his power was not always absolute. Lords, clergy, and the nobility also wielded considerable power. The church played a pivotal role in the feudal system, as it was not just a religious institution, but also a political force. Popes, bishops, and even cardinals held significant power, not only in religious matters, but also politically. They could intervene in political issues, especially those related to the decisions of lords and kings. Kings often needed the cooperation of the church to maintain their power and protect their sovereignty. The feudal system was not just a governance structure, but also a network of interconnected relationships among lords, clergy, and other classes in society. Those at the highest positions could demand loyalty from those at lower levels, while peasants and common laborers lived in poverty and were dependent on the upper classes. One of the main characteristics of the feudal system was the clear distinction between rights and obligations across different social classes. Peasants and laborers were obligated to provide produce, labor, and taxes to their lords and the church. Lords, nobility, and the king had the duty to protect the peasants and maintain social stability, although this was not always faithfully carried out. Moreover, in the feudal system, most decisions about social life were based on loyalty and duty. Rights and obligations were not regulated by national laws, but by social conventions and traditions. This led to a sustainable but inflexible economic system, one that was unable to adapt quickly to major changes. The feudal economy had sustainable aspects, but it was also highly vulnerable to external factors. A poor harvest, invasions by enemies, or disease outbreaks could collapse the entire economy of a region. However, due to the self-sufficient nature of the system and the strict management by lords and the church, the feudal economy was also capable of maintaining and recovering in many cases. Despite this, factors like prolonged wars and dependence on the upper classes could lead to instability. The lack of developed trade networks and the poverty of the majority of the population were elements that could not change quickly and sometimes led to stagnation in the feudal economy. Hoi ChatGPT. In feudal society where power and wealth were controlled by the aristocracy and the king, the stark divide between the rich and poor and the inherent injustices in the distribution of land and power often led to tension and dissatisfaction among the common people. Despite the oppression that peasants faced under the rule of lords, they were not silent. In fact, uprisings, both small and large, erupted throughout this period. These revolts were not only a reflection of the discontent within society, but also a manifestation of the struggle for justice and rights for the oppressed classes. Feudal society, grounded in the system of land ownership, created a distinct division between social classes. Lords and nobles controlled land and political power, while peasants who worked the land lived in poverty and were oppressed by their landowners. These peasants were not only burdened with high taxes, but also had to deliver a portion of their harvest to the lords. Often their hardships were exacerbated by natural calamities such as droughts, floods, or wars fought by the lords to expand their landholdings. These elements further pushed the peasants into deeper poverty, creating a volatile environment ripe for social unrest. In feudal society, despite being oppressed and impoverished, peasants were not passive. They sought ways to resist and fight back against the power of the lords through small-scale uprisings. These uprisings were often unorganized, but stemmed from deep-seated frustrations and grievances of the poor, laboring masses. For example, a small rebellion might occur when a lord raised taxes or forced peasants into additional unpaid labor, corvée labor. When living conditions became too harsh, peasants would organize protests or small uprisings to resist. However, due to a lack of organization and broad consensus, most of these uprisings were swiftly quelled. One of the largest and most significant uprisings in feudal history was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. This uprising was fueled by a combination of rising taxes, prolonged wars, and peasants' growing dissatisfaction with the absolute power of the nobility. Led by Wat Tyler, the revolt saw thousands of peasants marching and attacking castles, churches, and centers of power. The rebels demanded tax reductions and the abolition of unpaid labor systems. However, the revolt was ultimately suppressed with force, aided by the royal army. Although the revolt failed, it left a lasting impact on history, exposing the mounting anger of peasants toward feudal governance and the growing divide between the wealthy and the poor. The Peasants' Revolt also marked the beginning of movements advocating for the rights of the working class in the centuries to come. Another notable uprising in feudal times was the Jacquerie in France in 1358. This rebellion primarily took place among the peasantry in northern France. It was sparked by dissatisfaction with the nobility and the burdens of war, the Hundred Years' War, as well as oppression from the landowners. The revolt involved thousands of peasants who attacked the castles of the nobility, killing and destroying what they believed to be the symbols of injustice. However, this uprising was short-lived, as the army of the nobles and the king brutally suppressed it. Many of the participants were killed, and feudal authorities maintained their control. Nevertheless, the Jacquerie served as a clear indication of the increasing tensions between the different classes in feudal society. One of the powerful forces behind uprisings in feudal society was war. Throughout the feudal period, wars, especially those for political power, generated widespread discontent. Peasants were forced to participate in wars, pay taxes for military expenses, while the leaders of these wars reaped the rewards of conquered land.
Uprisings such as the German Peasants' War, 1524 to 1525, were not just reactions to societal injustice, but also reflections of the people's desire for freedom and rights. Although the uprising ultimately failed, it marked an important step in the development of resistance movements and a yearning for change. Although uprisings often failed and were violently suppressed, they had a profound and lasting influence on the transformation of feudal society. These revolts highlighted fundamental issues within society such as the unequal distribution of wealth, the autocratic rule of the nobility, and the lack of justice for the peasant class. These uprisings also set the stage for more significant changes in the future. After these revolts, lords and nobles were sometimes forced to alter their policies or concede to some demands from the peasants in order to maintain social stability. While no revolt completely toppled the feudal system, both small and large uprisings contributed to shifting perceptions of power, rights, and justice. Uprisings in feudal society, while not always bringing about immediate change, had a deep and lasting effect on the development of society. They not only reflected the dissatisfaction of the lower classes, but also served as indicators of a society gradually recognizing the need for reform and justice. The uprisings of peasants stand as proof of the resilience and potential strength of the working class in feudal times, and they became an integral part of the larger historical movement towards social revolutions in the later centuries. In the feudal world, life was not about glory or victory, but about survival, an ongoing, resilient existence through the trials of nature, disease, and class distinction. The peasants, though never mentioned in the great historical records, were the backbone of the feudal system. They were nameless, without fame, yet their efforts were deeply embedded in the land they plowed, the wheat they grew, and the fields they tended to with each passing season. As time went on, societal upheavals, revolts, and great events changed the course of history, but for the peasants, life continued at its steady pace. The long, cold nights, the grueling harvest seasons, and the small gatherings to discuss rights and duties, these were the unchanging aspects of their everyday existence. Even though revolts and resistance against the oppression of the nobility and clergy occurred, the poor peasants lived in a state of dependence and resignation. As the feudal powers continued to control everything from land to spiritual life, the people found comfort only in their perseverance, surviving from day to day. Some sought freedom by fleeing, but faced with the dangers of the world outside, they soon realized that the only place they could truly survive, albeit in hardship, was the small village where they were born and raised. In the final years of the feudal era, the villages grew quieter, not just because of the uprisings, but also due to the inevitable changes from the outside world. The revolutions in the cities, the rise of trade and industry, and the transformation of nations into a new era gradually shifted the traditional values that had been upheld by feudal society for centuries. The peasants continued to work the land, but they could sense a subtle change in the air, a change not from the outside world, but from within themselves. However, despite the changes occurring, feudal society still maintained a strong presence through its humble people. These people never questioned personal gain or lofty ambitions. They lived solely to maintain stability for their families, their communities, and the village they called home. Even in a peaceful existence that might seem dull to outsiders, these peasants found strength in unity and a belief in the simple life. The story of feudal life may never truly end. The peasants may never have a grand finale to tell, nor will they have heroic deeds or glorious battles to be remembered in history. However, they laid the foundation from which future generations would grow and change. They are the ones who built civilization, the unsung heroes whose contributions to society were immense, even though they remained nameless. A life full of challenges, but also filled with simple joys, love within families and communities, and a reverence for values they deemed sacred. These feudal peasants, though with little power, possessed an enormous strength in sustaining the stability of society. Even when it seemed like they were forgotten, their stories resonated in the villages, in the fields, and in the old homes with moss-covered roofs. In the end, the story of the peasants is a lesson in patience and endurance. While they could not change the world, they preserved their existence, their inner freedom, and a strong belief in a brighter tomorrow. Though feudal peasants may never be celebrated in the annals of history, their legacy lives on through what they left behind for future generations. Their diligent work, their efforts in preserving the land, the traditions they passed down, and the everyday habits they shaped are the building blocks of the society we see today. They never placed themselves above others, but because of their sacrifices, society today can inherit a solid foundation. History may record the victories of kings and the great revolutions, but it was the feudal peasants who ensured the survival of society through every generation. This is a legacy that cannot be denied.